What if the Browns' next big move isn't about finding the right quarterback, but about handing the keys to the entire operation? Because what's being whispered right now around Cleveland isn't normal NFL chatter. It's the kind of talk that only surfaces when a franchise feels boxed in, out of options, and desperate for a reset. Over the past few days, insiders have started floating a name that immediately turns heads: John Harbaugh. Not just as a potential coach, but as someone who would demand real power. We're talking full control, top-tier money, and the ability to shape the roster his way. And on its own, that sounds wild. But then you factor in one detail that changes everything. Shedeur Sanders. Love him or hate him, the reality is simple. People are paying attention to the Cleveland Browns right now because of him. Not because they're winning, not because they're contenders, but because his name pulls eyes, clicks, and conversation. And in today's NFL, attention isn't just noise, it's leverage. That's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because if the Browns believe relevance is slipping and patience is running out, suddenly, the idea of a proven coach with a quarterback-friendly resume starts looking less risky and more necessary. Especially one who's already shown he can build an entire system around a polarizing QB and make it work. None of this is confirmed. No deals are done. But when multiple insiders start circling the same idea, it usually means something deeper is happening behind closed doors. And if this move actually happens, it wouldn't just change the Browns. It would expose how far a franchise is willing to go when the spotlight and the pressure gets too intense to ignore. At first glance, the idea sounds ridiculous. Why would a stable, Super Bowl winning coach even entertain stepping into one of the most volatile situations in the league? Why would Cleveland think it could pull that off? Those are fair questions. But the reason this rumor won't die is because it didn't come from nowhere. It came from context. Right now, the Browns aren't just losing games. They're losing narrative control. Every season feels like a rerun. New promises, familiar endings, coaching questions, quarterback questions, organizational questions. And when that cycle repeats long enough, franchises stop thinking in terms of tweaks and start thinking in terms of overhaul. That's where this story begins. According to reports and insider speculation, John Harbaugh wouldn't even consider a move unless the situation was fundamentally different from a normal coaching hire. Not a patch job, not a shared power setup, something closer to a reset button. The kind of opportunity that doesn't come from confidence, but from leverage. Cleveland has that leverage problem right now. The front office knows the fan base is restless. They know national perception hasn't improved, and they know that simply changing coordinators or drafting another quarterback won't buy them the patience they need. In today's NFL, patience comes from belief, and belief comes from bold direction. That's why Harbaugh's name sticks. He represents instant credibility, not hype, not hope, credibility. A coach who's done it before, managed big personalities, and won at the highest level. And when insiders start connecting that type of coach to a franchise like Cleveland, it usually signals one thing. Internal conversations have shifted from "how do we fix this?" to "how do we completely change this?" And here's the part most people miss. This isn't just about coaching, it's about structure. The Browns' current setup spreads responsibility across too many hands. When things go wrong, accountability gets blurry. That's why the idea of one strong voice, one clear authority, becomes appealing during moments of pressure. Is this confirmed? No. Is it guaranteed? Absolutely not. But rumors like this don't gain traction unless there's a reason people believe the door is even slightly open. And in Cleveland's case, that door exists because the alternative, staying the same, has already failed too many times. And once that reality sets in, the next question is if drastic ideas get discussed. It's how far the Browns are actually willing to go. Here, where the conversation stops being casual speculation and starts sounding serious. Because when insiders began talking about what it would actually take for John Harbaugh to even listen, the list wasn't small, and it definitely wasn't standard. According to reports and league chatter, this wouldn't be a normal head coach interview. No polite sit-down. No fit-the-existing system discussion. The claim is that Harbaugh would want elite-level money, a massive assistant coach budget, and most importantly, real authority over the roster. Not influence, not suggestions, control. And that last part is where everything shifts. Because giving one coach that much power would require the Cleveland Browns to completely rewrite how they operate. It would mean changing the balance between ownership, the front office, and the coaching staff. Draft decisions wouldn't just be collaborative, they'd be guided. Personnel moves wouldn't be filtered through layers, they'd be direct. For most teams, that's a non-starter, but Cleveland isn't most teams. When a franchise has cycled through coaches, quarterbacks, and philosophies without results, control becomes less scary than stagnation. And that's why this rumor doesn't sound as impossible as it should. Because if you're going to take a big swing, you don't do it halfway. What makes this even more interesting is why these demands would exist in the first place. Harbaugh has seen what happens when systems don't match quarterbacks. He's lived through the criticism, the doubt, and the pressure to change a player instead of the environment. And insiders suggest that if he were to take on a new challenge, it would only be under conditions where alignment is guaranteed. That's where Shedeur Sanders quietly enters the equation. This isn't being framed as coach wants control to help his guy. It's being framed as coach wants control so development isn't sabotaged. There's a difference. One sounds selfish, the other sounds strategic, and whether people agree with it or not, that framing matters in NFL circles. Of course, none of this is confirmed. These are reported prerequisites, not signed terms. But the fact that insiders are even discussing them publicly tells you something important. Cleveland is being viewed as a place where extreme solutions might actually be considered. And once a franchise starts entertaining extreme solutions, the line between rumor and reality gets very thin, very fast. Normally, a list of demands like that would shut conversations down immediately. Too expensive, too risky, too much power handed to one person. But Cleveland isn't operating from a place of comfort right now. They're operating from pressure. And pressure changes how decisions get made. The Browns aren't just fighting for wins, they're fighting relevance. Every season that slips away without direction chips at fan trust and organizational patience. At some point, incremental changes stop working. Fans tune out. Media narratives harden. And ownership starts asking whether playing it safe is actually the riskiest option of all. That's why this idea refuses to die. From a purely football standpoint, handing that much authority to a head coach feels dangerous. But from a business standpoint, it's oddly logical. A proven name instantly stabilizes perception. It tells fans and players that the franchise isn't guessing anymore, it's committing. And commitment buys time, something Cleveland desperately needs. There's also the quarterback reality. Developing young QBs in chaos rarely works. Changing coordinators, shifting philosophies, and mixed messaging ruin confidence fast. If the Browns believe Shedeur Sanders could be a long-term solution, then protecting that development becomes priority one. Not winning now, not saving face, development. That's where full control becomes attractive. A coach who can align personnel, scheme, and messaging removes the usual friction. No second guessing, no quiet disagreements leaking out. One vision, clearly executed. It's the kind of structure that organizations flirt with only when they feel boxed in. And let's be honest, Cleveland is boxed in. There's also the attention factor that no one wants to admit out loud. The NFL is an entertainment business, whether fans like it or not. Storylines matter. Visibility matters. A move like this doesn't just change the locker room, it changes the national conversation. Primetime slots, constant coverage, relevance restored overnight. That kind of spotlight can't fix football problems, but it can buy patience while solutions are built. Of course, the risk is enormous. If it works, it's visionary. If it fails, it becomes a case study in overreach. But from Cleveland's perspective, the alternative, another quiet reset, might feel worse than public failure. That's the mindset shift people underestimate. This isn't about ego, it's about urgency. And urgency pushes franchises toward decisions they'd never consider under normal circumstances. Which is why the conversation keeps circling back to one uncomfortable truth. Cleveland might be willing to give up control, not because it wants to, but because it feels like it has nothing left to lose. And that's exactly when the most dangerous bets get placed. Here's the part of this story that makes people uncomfortable, even if they won't say it out loud. Shedeur Sanders isn't just a quarterback in Cleveland. He's an attention magnet. And in today's NFL, attention is a currency just as real as wins and losses. Everywhere Shedeur goes, conversation follows. Not quietly, not gradually, immediately. Social media clips, debates, arguments, supporters and skeptics all showing up at once. And whether you believe that should matter or not, front offices absolutely pay attention to it. Because relevance keeps pressure off ownership longer than empty stadiums ever will. This is why insiders keep repeating the same point. People are talking about the Browns because Shedeur is there. Not because the roster is stacked. Not because the team is dominant. But because he creates intrigue. That's not an insult to football purity, it's a reflection of reality. The league sells stories, and quarterbacks sit at the center of every one of them. What makes Shedeur different is that the conversation doesn't disappear when he struggles. It intensifies. Every performance becomes a referendum. Every throw sparks a narrative. That's exhausting for a player, but it's valuable for a franchise starving for visibility. And Cleveland knows this. They've watched years go by where no one cared enough to argue about them. This is also why the Harbaugh discussion feels tied to Shedeur, even if no one explicitly says it. A high-profile quarterback without a high-level stabilizer becomes chaos. A high-profile quarterback with a respected, proven coach becomes a controlled experiment. That's the distinction Cleveland is quietly weighing. And then there's the comparison factor. Fans have seen this before. Quarterbacks who were doubted, labeled as system guys, criticized for style instead of substance, only to thrive once the system finally adapted to them. Whether that comparison is fair or not doesn't matter. The belief that it could happen is enough to fuel the conversation. None of this guarantees success. Attention doesn't complete passes. Followers don't win games. But attention buys patience, and patience buys development time. For a franchise that has repeatedly rushed decisions out of fear, that breathing room matters. This is why Shedeur's presence shifts everything. He forces Cleveland to confront what it actually values right now: quiet rebuilding or loud belief, safe decisions or controlled risk. Because once you have a quarterback who brings this level of spotlight, doing nothing stops being an option. And when standing still isn't possible, franchises start moving in directions they never planned to go. This is where the conversation shifts from rumor to rationale. Because anyone who's followed the NFL closely knows this story has a familiar shape. Before he became an MVP, before the playoff runs, before the respect, Lamar Jackson was doubted in ways that now sound ridiculous. People questioned if he could really play quarterback, said he was too raw, too unconventional, too dependent on athleticism. Some even suggested changing his position altogether. And those doubts didn't come from random fans. They came from analysts, executives, and voices inside the league. Sound familiar? What changed everything was Lamar suddenly becoming a different player. It was the environment around him. When John Harbaugh committed to building around Lamar instead of forcing Lamar into a preset mold, the entire trajectory flipped. The offense adapted. The roster aligned. The messaging stayed consistent. And once that happened, the noise faded. That's why people keep bringing this comparison up in connection with Shedeur Sanders. Not because they're the same player, they're not. Different styles, different strengths, different games. The parallel is philosophical, not physical. It's about belief. Shedeur has faced his own version of early labeling. Too polished, too protected, too media-friendly, too much of a brand. Critics focus on aesthetics instead of processing, on perception instead of preparation. And just like Lamar, those critiques often ignore what actually shows up on film. The lesson from Baltimore wasn't just about scheme. It was about trust. Harbaugh didn't flinch when criticism came. He didn't panic after rough games. He doubled down. That kind of stability is rare in the NFL. And it's exactly what young quarterbacks need to grow, without constantly looking over their shoulder. This is why the idea of pairing a proven QB developer with a polarizing young quarterback feels logical to some insiders. Not guaranteed, not safe, but logical, because we've seen what happens when patience and alignment actually exist at the professional level. Of course, there's a flip side. For every Lamar Jackson story, there are dozens that didn't work, systems that failed, coaches who overestimated control, quarterbacks who never took the leap. That's the risk Cleveland would be accepting if it followed this blueprint. But the reason this comparison won't go away is simple. It's proof that early narratives aren't destiny. They're just noise until someone with authority decides otherwise. And if Cleveland believes that Shedeur Sanders deserves that kind of commitment, then the Lamar Jackson example stops being history and starts looking like a roadmap. Here, where everything gets dangerous. Not exciting, not bold, dangerous. Because if Cleveland even considers this path, they're not just hearing a coach, they're rewriting the power structure of the entire franchise. Giving one person sweeping authority over football operations is the kind of move teams only make when they feel cornered. It means ownership stepping back, the front office swallowing its pride, years of internal checks and balances suddenly collapsing into one voice. And if that voice belongs to John Harbaugh, the bet is simple: trust experience over process. That's a massive gamble. On one hand, unified power can eliminate confusion. No mixed messaging, no internal leaks, no philosophical tug-of-war between coaches and executives. Decisions get made faster, direction becomes clearer. And for a young quarterback like Shedeur Sanders, that clarity could be the difference between growth and burnout. But the downside is brutal. If it works, Harbaugh looks like a visionary who rescued a broken organization. If it fails, there's no one else to blame. No coordinator to fire. No GM to scapegoat. The failure becomes centralized and public. Every loss gets magnified. Every roster miss becomes a referendum on authority. And Cleveland has lived this nightmare before, handing power to individuals only to watch it collapse under pressure. That history matters. The Cleveland Browns don't just have a reputation for losing, they have a reputation for overcorrecting. Big swings meant to erase decades of frustration, only to reset the clock again. That's why critics see this idea as reckless. Not because it's bold, but because it echoes past mistakes wrapped in new packaging. There's also the human factor. NFL locker rooms are unforgiving. Players don't just buy into systems, they test them. If results don't come quickly, trust erodes. And when all power flows through one person, frustration has nowhere to go except straight up. That's the paradox Cleveland is facing. Structure could bring stability, or it could concentrate pressure until something snaps. This isn't about ego. It's about risk tolerance, about deciding whether control is the cure or just another accelerant. And once a franchise starts seriously weighing that question, there's no neutral outcome. Because choosing not to gamble is still a gamble. And choosing to gamble everything on one vision is how franchises either find their identity or lose themselves completely. This is the moment where Cleveland has to look itself in the mirror, not as a fan base, not as a headline, but as an organization deciding what it actually believes in. Because this situation isn't just about hearing a coach or developing a quarterback. It's about choosing an identity. For years, the Browns have tried to fix symptoms instead of causes. New coaches, new systems, new quarterbacks. Each move sold as the missing piece, each failure followed by another reset. And now, sitting at another crossroads, the temptation isn't to tweak the plan, it's to tear it up completely. That's why this conversation feels so heavy. On one side is safety, incremental change, another rebuild that promises patience and discipline, even if history suggests it leads right back to the same place. On the other side is something far more uncomfortable, surrendering control in exchange for belief, betting that alignment, authority, and conviction matter more than traditional structure. That's the real gamble here. If Cleveland chooses the radical path, they're not just chasing wins. They're chasing relevance, stability, and a narrative that finally moves forward instead of looping. But that path comes with a price. Every mistake would be amplified, every loss dissected, every decision questioned through the harshest possible lens. There would be no quiet failures, only loud ones. And yet, doing nothing might be worse. Because stagnation is invisible, but it's deadly. Fans drift, players disengage, hope fades slowly, then all at once. Franchises don't collapse in spectacular fashion, they erode. And the fear inside Cleveland right now isn't embarrassment. It's becoming irrelevant again. That's what makes this decision so defining. Not whether it works, but what it says. Does this organization trust its instincts enough to go all in on a vision? Or does it retreat to caution, even if caution has failed before? The truth is, there's no outcome without consequences. Success would rewrite Cleveland's story overnight. Failure would reinforce every negative stereotype the franchise has spent decades trying to escape. But either way, it would be decisive, clear, final. And sometimes, clarity is worth the risk. Because franchises aren't remembered for playing it safe. They're remembered for the moments they dared to believe in something bigger, right or wrong. And whatever Cleveland decides next won't just shape a season. It will define who they are for years to come.